Hello, and thank you for tuning in to my channel. I'm really glad that you were able to take the time and check out what ideas I have to share with you. This one is pretty amazing, and being a man of faith, I really believe that God put this idea into my head and was hoping that I could share it with the world. And maybe enough of you are listening or watching and seeing this, maybe it could become a reality. I appreciate you taking the time and checking out my video. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I present to you a better way. Throughout history, people have been looking for a better way of living, having to endure the various types of political governments, each promising a better way. Most societies all started from a reigning monarch known as the king. Usually, in the beginning, it was because the king was the strongest and wisest person in the clan. I guess they figured those attributes would be handed down through the gene line to their descendants. Well, history tells us that didn't happen, and most monarchs were lousy leaders at some point in the generational line. The king answered to no one. His word was law, and there was no dispute. Given our current situation with government not being able to come to any conclusion on anything, having a king wouldn't be so bad, especially if he was righteous. See, in God's eyes, a righteous king is the best form of government. He demonstrated this in the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in a dream. And of course, when Jesus Christ comes down and reigns as King of Kings over the entire earth. Other societies tried communism, where everything was owned by the state, so nobody owned anything, and each person was paid by the state an amount equivalent to their worth. The hopes here was the people would aspire for greater worth. Problem was the state doesn't have enough money to keep paying everybody. Most communist countries are poor, and the people tend to starve, unless you are in the government as a political employee or in the military. Then there's socialism, where people can own their properties and businesses, but most of everything else is owned or controlled by the state. This is very similar to communism in that the government controls and provides for everyone. The results are the same as communism, as the state typically runs out of money and everybody starts to starve. All hail capitalism is the best way to go. It is the economic and political system in which the country's trade and industry are controlled by the private owners for profit. This system has been in effect in the U.S. for 250 years, and our country has been going strong, at least up until around the year 2000. So the problem: political corruption has infiltrated our Congress and Senate, and that the well-being of the people has been pushed aside for political ambition and financial gain of the politicians. The national debt has risen exponentially, with nothing to show for it. Our economy is on a dire brink of collapse due to our high debt to low income ratio. People are becoming destitute due to low employment and are begging on every street corner and living in tents. Capitalism used to be great, and that it drove competition and innovation in an effect to offer something better than the competition. But now, corporations just buy out competition to acquire that innovation. We've seen such horrible greed in the energy industry, from gluttonous oil companies to Enron creating an artificial shortage of electrical supply and gouging California to pay an exorbitant amount of money just to keep the lights on. We've also seen unbelievable greed in the financial sector. In 2008, when Congress created policies that allowed people to buy houses for values that they could not normally afford, and lending negative loans. Then the financial sector sold off these loans as AAA loans or insured these loans against failing, knowing full well that after 5 years, when the full bill was due, they would fail. The determined to be stock market was also a total collapse, and millions of Americans saw their 401ks evaporate. Congress bailed out the financial industries, but for the billions and millions of Americans who were going to retire ended up devastated. Nobody bailed them out. At least the CEO of Enron went to prison, whereas the people causing the financial meltdown didn't even get their hands slapped. In fact, the Bank of America threw an expensive party to celebrate the taxpayers' expense. We didn't see any remorse for their part in this action. I'm sure that the politicians who created the bleeding heart policy in the first place and paid the way for the bailouts had their pockets nicely lined by the ones who stand to gain the most. Capitalism allows the greatest freedoms of any political system to date. The main problem with capitalism is money. Or should I say, the greed or love of money. According to the Bible in 1 Timothy 6:10, "For the love of the money is the root of all kinds of evil." Money is the downside to capitalism, plain and simple. People in the U.S. are looking for an answer to our economic and political problems, and some are looking to socialism as the answer, and we know that that would be a very big mistake. So what's the answer? Capitalism without the money. Imagine the freedom from money. Why do corporations not choose to do the right things? That is because it's not profitable. It would cost too much to do the right things, so they settle for less, which means we, the public, settle for less. Why are we not all driving electric cars? Because they cost too much. Oil companies have been trying to suppress innovation in fuel economy and alternative energy/fuel for mobiles for years, so as to keep the money flowing in. Why are corporations polluting our atmosphere and not incorporating the best innovations to clean their pollution? Because it costs too much. Why are people living in the streets? Because it costs too much for rent. Why are people living in poverty? Because it costs too much to pay for education, childcare, healthcare, and everything else that it would require to get good schools and get higher education. Everything requires money to pay for everything that costs too much. So imagine the United States of America just as it is right now, but everything is free. Anarchy, right? Well, imagine if every American citizen was defined by a certain level of status that would allow them to certain entitlements. The basic entitlement would allow people to have food, clothing, housing, personal care items, electronic entertainment, and furniture. So if you were a person without a job and living on the streets, you would now be living in an apartment with basic food in the cupboards, clothes in your closet, and a TV, computer, furniture, all in that apartment. All the basic necessities of life would be available to the basic individuals. This would include health care and treatment for drugs and alcohol dependency, so even your so-called winos would have a future to look forward to. Level of status would increase with education, length of employment, importance of job role with the company, and other factors that define the level you should be at. There would be many levels that would help to inspire individuals to strive to increase their value through education or job placement, which would entitle them to acquire better and more luxurious things. So even a previous millionaire would be entitled to the luxuries that they are accustomed to, so as they would be at a much higher level than most because of their importance in the industry. There would be no money to transfer, so corruption would go away. People would not sell anything, so stealing things would no longer happen, unless it was something of high value, but most of the petty thefts would no longer happen, as a person would simply go to get what they need. Radios, HD TVs, electronics as such would be available to everyone, so what would be the point of stealing it? Education, healthcare, to name a couple, would be free to every American citizen. Corporations and businesses, small and large, would hire more people, because they wouldn't have to pay them. People would be hired based on their skills and education to fulfill the roles they needed in the industry, just as they do now. They wouldn't just hire people to do nothing. Everything would basically remain the same regarding people going to work and doing well in their positions. If an employee is not meeting the expectations and performing poorly, then the company would let them go, just like they would today. That would result in a drop in their level, but would not necessarily remove all the items they have earned. With regards to the corporations, If it didn't cost anything to build something, then if you wanted to be the best, then you'd build the best and be dominant in the world market because you could offer whatever you built at a very competitive price as regulated by the World Trade Organization. Medical research would not be restricted to limited funding. Cures for cancer, diseases, genetic illnesses, and a host of other medical issues would be going full throttle for cures to issues that plague our well-being. In America, everything would be free, including natural resources. Some resources are not easily found in the U.S., such as rare earth and titanium. Some natural resources we have to purchase from other countries. But without money, how could we purchase them? We would have to barter with goods and services that are produced here in the U.S. So another country that would want our goods and service would have to pay for them and be deposited into an account for their equivalent value of the goods and services. This account would be set up through the U.S.A. International Bank. The money is not credited to the companies that supplied the goods and services. It is wholly owned by the United States government. Then, when companies in the U.S. need to purchase raw materials, the U.S. would use the credit from the International Bank. This all takes place outside the U.S. and does not interfere or affect with the moneyless society that's within the United States. Another example of using the International Bank is for travel. International travel for American citizens would be handled by the U.S. government. They would allow for the amount that the traveler needs based on the person's level. In all fairness, that amount would be considered higher than a person's level they could normally afford. So relatively speaking, a person at a corporate level who roughly makes, let's say, $70,000 a year would be granted a budget for someone who would make around $90,000 a year. This would help cost for the travel and allow that person to have a little bit nicer vacations. The American traveler would be given a debit card and would withdraw the money from that account that they are set up through the International Bank. Once the balance is withdrawn down, then the vacation is over and they fly home free on an airline that is American owned. For foreign travelers that are coming to the United States, the opposite would apply. Every time the foreign traveler wishes to purchase something within the United States, they are given a status card that is similar to what the Americans would be able to purchase at their equivalent level. And the money that was spent was deposited into the International Bank of the United States. Therefore, the money would come from the foreign traveler's own bank account. Status cards would be issued to every American citizen, and it would work similar to the new smart chip card reader for credit cards, except the new cards would have a photo ID and a fingerprint bioreader on the card. The card would also have a secret code in the smart chip that synchronizes the person with that card. It would be non-hackable. This would assure that only the person acquiring the goods and services can use that card. There would be a state government agency that issues the status cards and keeps track of who is at what level, which would feed into a federal government agency that also helps keep track of this. This would help facilitate interstate travel. These agencies would regulate what the American citizens would be entitled to based upon what level they are given. It also would regulate how often a product can be acquired, such as how many times one could acquire a couch or an appliance or alcohol, for examples. This would help in regulating the acquisition of goods, so to help prevent using those goods for barter situations and to help manage natural resources. The initial response from the general public will be to acquire as much stuff as they can, but eventually that will level off as general public will find having too much stuff is a burden. The federal government agency would set the level range and guidelines for all employment positions just like the Department of Labor does today, and what the pay range should be at. The government guidelines would spell out how much experience and education each level should have. The corporations and businesses would be one of those sectors that handle level increases. They would follow the government guidelines of the value for the position that they have in their company and offer levels within the range allowed by the government. This would provide the companies with the ability to be competitively attractive and hire people with desired skills and education. Promotions would constitute level increases. It would be responsibility of the company to not just issue the highest level allowable within the range so as not to abuse the system. The one thing that should be corrected is the cost of living in certain regional areas. So what the entitlements would be for level 6 in San Francisco would be the same as in Oklahoma City, which we know for a fact is not really anywhere close to being like that today. It is this sort of ridiculous, it's kind of ridiculous if you think about it, that it costs so much to live in the Bay Area, and the companies who employ there have to pay such high wages so that employees can afford to even just live there. So if you were to scale down the cost of living there, then the companies should be able to scale down their wages. It makes little sense if you think about it, because the cost of living is directly proportional to the wage. In the same way, annual raises are directly proportionate to inflation, according to Economics 101, that is. So if we eliminate annual raises, it would eliminate inflation. But there won't be any money, so we wouldn't have inflation anyways. Level increases should be contingent with promotions or a higher education degree. Colleges and universities would be another sector in society that handle level increases for their employees. Students, upon receiving degrees, would receive an increase in their level based upon the degree they earned, such as an associate's, bachelor's, master's, and even doctorates. Another way for people to get a higher level would be to join the military. The military would receive higher levels of status than your standard Joe Blow, because people in the military risk everything to serve their country. The military personnel, should they be wounded or maimed in combat, then their status would even go up higher. They would receive the best in medical care and latest technology for prosthetics and treatment. They and their families would receive a lavish lifestyle that they so justly deserve for what they sacrificed to keep our country safe. Some changes that would happen with this moneyless society. In this new society, there would be many changes to companies and certain agencies in the government that would really be no longer needed, such as the favorite of all, the IRS. Also, the Treasury Department, banks, stock markets, and, well, any other sector that deals strictly with money. There will be no money inside the U.S., so jobs dealing with money would, well, fade away. Fortunately, education is free, and if you were close to retirement, well, that would be a good time to initiate it. Speaking of retirement, for those people who reach the age of 60, they should be allowed to retire and given a retirement level, which, if they didn't already have before, would entitle them to acquiring an RV and more frequent international travel. This business of pushing the retirement age closer to 70 is just, well, ridiculous. If a person wishes to continue working after reaching the age of 60, then that's up to that individual, but not the companies. Companies should not force people to have to retire, nor should they make them have to wait for retirement. With a moneyless society, there are a few other things we should consider. For example, green card holders. Green card holders would be eligible to receive status cards and assigned a level by their employers. Something else that should be considered is the war on drugs. We must not forget one of the blights in our nation, and that is the drug addiction, especially for hardcore drugs like heroin and meth. Well, obviously people don't have any money and cannot acquire money, then they can't purchase illegal drugs. Drug cartels will immediately see the market collapse, as nobody in the U.S. will be able to purchase illegal drugs because they'd have no money to purchase them with. I would recommend that the U.S. makes marijuana, coca leaves, and basically psilocybin mushrooms as a legal alternative source for recreational drugs, and the U.S. government either purchase these drugs, especially coca leaves, from other countries or produce it in Colombia itself, where the cocoa plant grows. Figuring that if anything that God creates naturally, then it shouldn't be illegal. And let's face it, there will always be people wanting recreational drugs. Marijuana could be grown by individuals instead of having to acquire it from government-controlled drug supply stores. At least this way the government can control the quantity that as individuals use per week, thereby reducing the likelihood of dependency. The same would apply for alcohol. So let's go over some of the benefits of having a moneyless society. Everybody would have a place to live. They'd have food on the table, food in their belly, clothes on their backs, entertainment, and a car to drive, preferably an electric one, if that works in their situation. Corruption will pass away, especially in government. There's no money to corrupt, there's no corruption. Medical research will no longer be limited due to funding. So if there's a cure for something, it'll come out because there's no profit to be made after just treating it. Everyone will have a chance to better themselves through education, employment, and treatment centers. No longer will you be restricted to not being able to afford treatment because of costs. Excellent health care for everyone. There it is, the health care issue. It's solved right here. Everybody will have a job. If you want one, you got one. If you don't have to. Retirees won't have to worry about being on a limited income or will the stock market fluctuate and they lose everything overnight. Our military will have absolutely best of everything because if you risk your life, then there's nothing more we could do but give you what you deserve. Our corporations can incorporate the best systems from improving environmental emissions and the best products on the planet. If it costs a lot of money to make something better, that's no longer an issue. Businesses will have the best competitive advantages in the world market because you won't be restricted to how well you can make a product. Solar panels could be everywhere, transforming our nation to being the biggest electrically independent and greatly reducing our dependency on oil. We will be exporting oil instead of importing it. No more national debt. Other countries won't appreciate that, but they either will have to deal with it or maybe work out some other payment arrangements through the International Bank. Drug addiction to the illegal drugs would cease as a huge number of people would have to get enrolled into treatment centers as soon as the money ceases and their drugs run out. Either they will become sick or violently dependent on them. They would seek out treatment centers and could afford them. Therefore, the violence related to drug trafficking would cease as well. People would be free to fulfill their dreams of inventing something or entrepreneurs opening their own businesses. We can do anything we imagine and transform our nation into an amazing place to live. So how would we implement it? Well, you can always try to go and tell your state senator or congressman that the U.S. should be a moneyless society, especially if you agree that money is really the ultimate downfall for society. I know it's a long shot, and that most of these congressmen and senators will never agree on anything. And with these lobbyists and people around, having them line their pockets and helping them get reelected, it makes it hard to see that there's any possibility for change. But there always is hope. And you're listening to this, so I hope that's maybe another ear that could spread the word. The other alternative, and probably the only way, is to elect a king to rule over the United States. Hopefully one who is wise and righteous, so as not to abuse the all-encompassing and supreme power over the legislative and judicial branches of government. The executive branch would be replaced by the king. By having the predominant power, the king could enact the law abolishing money and revising our Constitution to eliminate that duty of the government. Once implemented, this nation would be transformed into a little bit of heaven. After all, I'm sure there is no currency in heaven. And if we were fortunate enough, we just might get a righteous king to lead this country. Amen.